Good evening, everyone. I haven't been joined by anyone in my panel as yet, but I will hold forth. Just setting up my screen so I can see the YouTube chat. And we will begin. So this evening, we'll be talking about two essays on analytical psychology. And this is part 4, which is called The Mana Personality. And so I'm going to read chapters or paragraphs one by one, and then comment on them. I'll be looking for your comments in chat on YouTube. So by all means, do comment. Okay, the Mana Personality, paragraph 374. My initial material for the discussion that now follows is taken from cases where the condition that was presented in the previous chapter as the immediate goal has been achieved, namely, the conquest of the anima as an autonomous complex and her transformation into a function of relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. With the attainment of this goal, it becomes possible to disengage the ego from all its entanglements with collectivity and collective unconscious. Through this process, the anima forfeits the demonic power of an autonomous complex. She can no longer exercising the power of possession since she is depotentiated. She is no longer the guardian of treasures unknown, no longer Kundry, daimonic messenger of the Grail, half divine and half animal, no longer the soul to be called mistress, but a psychological function of an intuitive nature, akin to what the primitives mean when they say, he has gone into the forest to talk with the spirits, or my snake spoke with me, or in the mythological language of infancy, a little bird told me. Okay, going back through this chapter, we were talking about anima as, let me just let some of my panelists in. Okay, good. All right, welcome everyone. I've just read
Thank you.
Paragraph 734, and so I'll do a commentary on it here until you're ready. So the first is the conquest of the anima as an autonomous complex. So I can say categorically now, because I've been studying Jung for a long time, that in 1993, I was possessed by my anima. And that possession caused me to write a novel. The novel has what we would genteelly call erotic content, which I didn't particularly want to have out in the public at that point. And so I put it in my drawer for 21 years. And because I couldn't explain where it came from. Now I understand that it came from that autonomous complex. The other is that everybody's seen my image of my mother as an image of my anima. And that anima caused me to leave my wife of 17 years and move in with my now wife of 34 years. And so it's a complex that's very powerful if you don't understand how it works. And those things happened to me in 1985 and 1993. I since have understood this. And so now I understand that this is an unconscious thing that happens to me, and I can recognize it as my anima, and therefore she can help me. So that's point one. So I can disengage my ego from its entanglement with the collectivity and the unconscious, and the collective unconscious. And so she loses demonic power. She can no longer exercise the power of possession since she is depotentiated. Okay, so she's definitely depotentiated in me at this point, and I do understand what she's about, and by long experience now. So, Jordan, you're here. Do you want to comment on this? And Annabelle, do you want
definitely. I think that's a classic example, because I think the depotentiated is that, in essence, that anima material is externalized. And I think that classic example makes a wonderful example for, instead of anima, animus, masculine, feminine, the anima and animus are both simply the creative drive in any individual. And I think then that, I mean, like you said, you didn't necessarily want the erotic content in public associated with your name. But what happens is, I think the anima, animus, and I will just simply say the creative drive, gives us examples from within that are intense and that challenge us to grow forward. And in that exposition of, I would say, discipline rather than discipline, you depotentiated that material to externalize the material. And I think that's critically important to how the creative drive works. It's not going to come in with a nice, oh, give this a shot. It's going to come in from left field at Mach 3 with its hair on fire, and you're going to grab, duck, move. But if you can grasp, and especially grasp with a comfortability of the not knowing, and allow yourself to ride those drives, then you end up creating something that's bigger than yourself.
I'm going to take exception to that a little bit, in that my creative drive is still definitely present. It's not depotentiated, but what it is now I know what it is. Now, if I wanted to write a novel, I would have no problem doing it. There's no such thing as writer's block if you understand these dynamics. And so you can, once you know how it works, you can write it, I'm pretty sure. I haven't tried to write a second novel. I haven't tried to write a book of poetry, another book of poetry, besides the one which is 50 poems on the subject of seduction. That was all a phase in 1993, but I certainly have many creative things that are going on, and yeah, to the extent they're connected to the anima, they're no longer autonomous, but I can now use them consciously.
Well, definitely, and I'll clarify my statement too, that it didn't depotentiate your creative drive. It actualized your creative drive to depotentiate those particular contents. And in that sense, it came forward, depotentiate, simply being, it's no longer potential energy, it's actual experiential, externalized energy put into form. So in a sense, that anima or creative drive energy that's formless was given form in the novel. So your creative drive wouldn't be depotentialized. Just that particular set of contents were depotentialized to nourish the creative act of writing that novel.
Yeah, and I did know a lot of Jungian concepts back then, and I had to really work out. I didn't have this book available to me back then, and so I really had to work out what was going on. And I finally concluded that I wrote the diary of my anima, okay, which is what I did, and I still stick to that. But I didn't get that from Jung. I got that by, thinking it out and figuring out that's what it was. So Annabelle, did you want to comment here?
I'm happy to be here again, and I have always been fascinated when you've talked about this being taken over by your anima process, which I've heard you talk about quite a few times before. Yes, and that writing. And for me as a writer, and being a writer is not the only thing that I do, but it is a major part of kind of how I identify myself. And I do a lot of what you might call writing projects. And I've written a novel. I've written several novellas, and I write poems lots and lots. And I've never been taken over in that way that you've spoken about. So I'm always fascinated by it, and by your expression of that. So I don't know what more to say. I don't mean to sound at all skeptical or as if I don't relate, because I certainly relate to the concept of something has to be written and it kind of writes itself, that sort of thing. Yeah. Also, the novel that I wrote, which took me about 7 years of actual writing, sections, drafts, there had been many years of what was, you might call research, but really it was just kind of an idea fermenting in my brain, collecting various files. But when that thing was done, it was done. And when there were moments when I knew I was kind of onto something, it had its own momentum. It had its own velocity. I like the way, Jordan, you use the term, Mach 5, or, whatever that is. There is that thing that I can relate to as like jet engines and a force. And force is really the right word for it. It's not power, it's force. And it's a force that exists that I do feel connected with at various times. And that, I've never looked for it. Maybe my meditation practice has nurtured it somewhat, but there really isn't anything else that I do except I write down my dreams, and I write when I know I need to write. And writing when I know I need to write, for me, is the same thing as I eat when I'm hungry. I play the piano when I want to work out a tune. I had a dream 3 nights ago of a song that in my dream I rewrote some of the words of it, and that led me to do various things because of that song, recordings of the song. So it's a subject to me that's just hugely broad. It's like a broad highway to talk about this subject you're talking about.
Right, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. So I don't think your experience and mine is any different. Go ahead, Jordan.
I was going to say, because even in the tarot, the French La Force is the strength card in French. And what happens is that's the power of the clarity of the natural inner animal voice. And it is as strong as a hurricane, or a hurricane turned down to volume level 0 is serenity. Neither one is any less intense. Just one has the volume turned down. And I correspond with my example. 1991, I had finished my thesis in architecture, and I decided I want to move somewhere I've never been to do something I've never done. And of course, every friend I had was like, "You're nuts." And I went, "Well, thank you very much. See you later, because in 2 weeks I'm leaving." And what's interesting is the go somewhere I've never been was Denver. And I may have been there asleep on a church bus on a ski trip sometime, but I never was like actually there. But the do something I'd never done was to support myself as an artist for 5 years. And the beautifully crazy thing about that was, other than a fox in kindergarten, I had never painted a lick in my life. And so how am I going to go and support myself painting as a profession when I've never painted? But the thing is, I got there. I went and got a 15 by 20 ball watercolor block, and I bought some canvas materials thinking, well, I should probably learn how to stretch a canvas, not knowing I was going to learn very quickly that stretching a canvas is like making a drum, and you'll tune it to the tightness until you're resonant with it. It's not that it's tight enough or lax enough. And what happened is my watercolors, which started first, they were mandalas. They were circular on 15 by 20 paper. The circle was 11 to 12 inches diameter. That's cool. They were very architectural, very sacred geometry and breaking bounds. But when I finished finally stretching several canvases and started painting in oils, it went dark and deep and thonic and depthful. And there were things where people would say, well, what were you thinking when you painted this? And I would, craftily say, oh, abstract expressionism. The meaning was in the act. The reality was that was a duck and cover for, I don't want you to know what I was thinking. These were dragons and internal concepts and contents that I was not comfortable saying out loud. But years later, I realized that was some of my most important work.
Sure.
And even now, there's a set of slides of those work somewhere out there, not the ones that I lost in a move. And I would like to have that series of 36 paintings in front of me. So there's kind of this every once in a while, hey, are you the one who has this little clear 2-inch square, 2.25-inch square box of slides, the old school stuff? But back to La Force, Annabelle, as you said, it's a force. And I think that goes with the strength card of clarity of inner animal intense voice that's absolutely on par with nature. And that's us being natural. And so when you were quote unquote taken over by, the storm brewed and a storm came about. And what I think is really beautiful about that is it's not a weakness in being taken. It's simply I don't waste trouble. This is occurring. So let's lead my internal forces into this process. And so whether you resisted or quibble every morning when she woke you the heck up, you did. And I think in that, there's that creative drive with a capital C and a capital D that you implement.
Well, right. And, that didn't give me an incentive to do more novels. I said, well, I'm not sure I'm going to find, at the time. But what it did was I was in a business in which I was struggling. I was leading the business. I founded it in 1990. But I was struggling. And so I was doing that first thing in the morning before I went into this business, right? And after I had done that, all of a sudden, boom, my business life started to work better. And in the next 11 years, I developed that business into a public company, which became the largest in its industry.
And that's a modern archetype. I mean, taking a public company, if I have a company and I'm a sole prop, or I incorporate LLC or Inc. or S Corp or however I do, it's still a company. It's somewhat mundane. But if I take the company public, that's more personal archetypal, because it's collective rather than I'm just simply, DBA my social or DBA my redundant EIN because I'm just one guy, and so you're right. I mean, I think like you say, your creative process started to work more acutely and
Right.
robustly, and through your business dealings, I would imagine that even the smell coming off of you from people was attractive. From let's do this. This is intense. It's more than profit. It's making something that's bigger than all of us.
And that led to something that I've been doing for the last 20 years to this very day. And while it's not yet ready for prime time, it could become a public company once again.
Right.
In fact, it has the potential to become two public companies. And it's not yet ready for prime time, but it is something that I'm working on and have been working on in various ways for 20 years. And I'm expecting it to take off within the next year. Okay. And so for YouTube people that are curious about what I'm working on, I'll put a website onto the chat. And
I like your example because of, instead of facts and damn facts and statistics, a little bird told you, so to speak, mythological. Yeah. And that's more powerful than any of the facts and graphs and stats that are there.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go on to the next paragraph, and let's see how long is it? It's okay. It's an Annabelle paragraph.
Okay.
Yeah, I get
So
that.
we're on 275.
375.
Yes, that was a 3. I thought it was a 3.
Yeah.
On page 227. Okay.
Right.
Those of my readers who know Rider Haggard's description of, quote, she who must be obeyed, close quote, will surely recall the magical power of this personality. Quote unquote, she is a mana personality, a being full of some occult and bewitching quality, mana, endowed with magical knowledge and power. All these attributes naturally have their source in the naive projection of an unconscious self-knowledge, which, expressed in less poetic terms, would run somewhat as follows, quote, I recognize that there is some psychic factor active in me which eludes my conscious will in the most incredible manner. It can put extraordinary ideas into my head, induce in me unwanted and unwelcome moods and emotions, lead me to astonishing actions for which I can accept no responsibility, upset my relations with other people in a very irritating way, etc. I feel powerless against this fact, and what is more, I am in love with it, so that all I can do is marvel, close quote. Poets often call this the artistic temperament. Unpoetical folk excuse themselves in other ways.
Right.
Oh, I love that.
So do we think that our former president ever had these thoughts?
It's funny because Mayor Pete Buttigieg, he was on I can't remember his first name, Jimmy Fallon, on the Jimmy Fallon show. And Jimmy Fallon said, well, Mayor Pete, do you realize that he compared you to the guy in Mad Magazine? And what do you think about that? And Mayor Pete said, and it's so hilarious, he said, well, as we've spoken before, it's important to enhance the dialogue. And maybe for the first time, I've caused that man to use a literary reference. And, you know, it was just so beautiful because, you know, I never before would have thought Mad Magazine is a literary reference, but it is published. So, you know, there you go.
Of course it does.
Alfred,
Yeah.
knew that would be what it was. But yeah, so the previous, wow, there's just so much. I'll stop. The previous.
Right. Okay, so read 376 and 377, please.
Okay. Now, when the anima loses her mana, what becomes of it? Clearly, the man who has mastered the anima, or person who has mastered the anima, requires her mana.
Acquires, not requires.
Or acquires her mana, in accordance with the primitive belief that when a man kills the mana person, he assimilates his mana into his own body. Well then, who is it that has integrated the anima? Obviously the conscious ego, and therefore the ego has taken over the mana. Thus the ego becomes a mana personality. But the mana personality is a dominant of the collective unconscious, the well-known archetype of the mighty man in the form of hero, chief, magician, medicine man, saint, the ruler of men and spirits, the friend of God.
Okay, I'll read the next paragraph.
Yeah, the next one's to go with those two very well.
Right. Paragraph 378. This masculine collective figure who now rises out of the dark background and takes possession of the conscious personality entails a psychic danger of a subtle nature. For by inflating the conscious mind, it can destroy everything that it has gained by coming to terms with the anima. It is therefore of no little practical importance to know that in the hierarchy of the unconscious, the anima occupies the lowest rank, only one of many possible figures, and that her subjection constellates another collective figure, which now takes over her mana. Actually, it is the figure of the magician, as I will call it for short, who attracts the mana to himself, i.e., the autonomous valency of the anima. Only insofar as I unconsciously identify with this figure can I imagine that I myself possess the anima's mana, but I will infallibly do so under these circumstances. So if we watch the rise and fall of the former president, who on one occasion sort of mused to himself as he was going to Marine One, well, maybe I am the selected, the chosen one, right? And so, he actually believes he's magic, and and in many ways he has been, because he's created this whole movement that is not under control at this point and can actually destroy the country. And so we have to be very conscious of that. But in the end, it's going to deflate, I would say. Comments?
Well, I'm off
You-
in another realm, you might say, because coincidentally, of course, as we know, all these things happen coincidentally. I think I've mentioned before that I'm paying attention to a lot of things Scottish because I am having a long-term preparation to go on a trip to visit Scotland. And the more I study, the more I realize I don't know. So I just watched the movie Ivanhoe, 1952,
Oh, wow.
Robert Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor, and Joan Fontaine.
Uh-huh. Ivanhoe.
And I was shocked. I mean, I remember reading Ivanhoe when I was small. Maybe it was a condensed version of it. I don't know. I thought I remembered the story. There were knights, there were all these things. But I watched this movie, and the way I tend to watch these movies on a computer, because I work on a computer all day, is I watch 15, 20 minutes at a time, and then that's enough for me, right? So I see them in chapters. And but I finished it today. And Elizabeth Taylor is a Jew whose name is Rebecca and her father is Isaac. And it's this whole thing of being a magician, and this whole thing of her, that she's, like, spoiler alert for anybody who's getting ready to watch this 1952 movie. But I mean, they're threatening to burn her on the stake because she supposedly has powers, but the powers that she supposedly has are simply, kind of like when I drink a cup of lion's mane tea, or I put some arnica on my inflamed muscles. This is the kind of thing, even that movie made very clear, we're not talking about, bringing down spacemen, or that she's transforming into a crow and flying away and coming back, even though someone bears witness and says that she did that. But you, the viewer, know that that's not really what's going on. And so I was just, baffled, stunned, awestruck. There's Sir Walter Scott, who I wanted to see something about Scotland, and it wasn't at all about Scotland. It was one of his English Waverley novel stories, but it still falls in the category of my sort of, generally speaking, Scottish research. But yeah, because just familiarizing myself with Sir Walter Scott is a good way of getting into the brain of some of the Scotsmen. But this story really threw me, and it's very much seems to be what this chapter is about. And I think that's what he was writing about.
Yeah. And I think directly from that, the autonomous valency, he says, speaks to that Elizabeth Taylor, not witch, that Elizabeth Taylor magician. And that's about, it indicates the autonomous valency, literally the orbits within. Like there's an inner astronaut, the inner solar system of the psyche, and she is literally living that. And someone else may have legitimately seen her turn into a crow and fly away because she activated their unconscious contents symbolically, directly, in such a way that their memory was indelibly replaced with what happened with she turned into a crow. And and not a raven, a crow, and flew away. And that those kinds of pieces and stories. It's funny you mentioned Ivanhoe, because I hadn't thought about that before, but now I wrote it down because that's going to kind of bump itself up in my list of like once a day or every other day.
We could even point to with magical thinking, what has happened within Christianity, where things that Christ did come down to us over 2,000 years, like the telephone game. And even though it's the same Bible, maybe sort of, kind of, but most of these stories weren't written down until maybe a century after he lived, or 80 years after. But example would be the resurrection of Lazarus. And this is a favorite topic of mine because Lazarus was dead, and Christ went back into his home, which it turns out was the home of Mary Magdalene, and Lazarus was her brother, and he showed her how Lazarus continues to live in exactly the same way in her heart. Okay, and so in that way, he made her grief bearable, and his own grief, because Lazarus was his friend. But we have this happen to us with all of our parents, where when they die, they're still here in every respect, except we can't add to their narrative. But in every other respect, they haven't left us. They're the ripples they made in life still have impact. And so even my mother-in-law, who is very much has lived an archetypal life of a mother and a librarian, and so she hopes that she will leave life having left no ripples. But what she left was a tidal wave in the form of her daughter, which she doesn't understand that what her daughter is, and what her daughter is to me, and what our role is together. All that comes from what she's done. And so she'd like to get out of life without making a ripple, or so the way her mind thinks. But the reality is she can't, she hasn't, and she won't.
Well, and that example directly speaks to the only insofar as I unconsciously identify with his figure, can I imagine that I myself possess the anima's mana. But I will infallibly do so under these circumstances, meaning she unconsciously doesn't identify with it very much. Therefore, the intensity of the actuality is relatively negligible, though you identify with that unconscious and conscious piece of that mana, which makes it just that much more intensely, indelibly present.
Right. And in the sense of immortality, if you go back, and if anybody hearing this goes back in your own family tree 12 generations or 14 generations, in my case it's 13 generations. My ancestors 13 generations ago were living in Holland, and then they came to New Amsterdam, and there were 5 of the first 150 European settlers in New Amsterdam. And even though they lived 400 years ago, the mana of that action of sailing across the Atlantic in a leaky boat in 1625 is still extremely with us, and with all Conovers. I mean, we all know the story, and you don't have to know the story. I can assure you that even if you don't know about your ancestors, they still live within you.
Well, it's interesting because I was always, what's this haggard vigilante that's not really a vigilante? This I will not dissolve thing that somehow transcended tenacity and endurance. And then my stepmom and my dad go to Norway because they had found the place on my dad's side where 476 years ago, it wasn't the hoggards, it was the swineherd's swine herds. And my whole joke of, oh, look at Hoggard, we are the ones who guard hogs, and we are hog guarders. So don't tell us we can spell, because we're going to misspell guard and hog guard. And my dad came back and he said, oh, it's worse. It's swineherd. And they left off the damn E, and they left off the H, but it is what it is. But the cool thing was this growing up quality in intensity, because the swineherd farm that was in my family 476 years ago was 400 feet deep and 1 mile long at a 40-degree angle with a 600-foot drop off at the edge of the yard. And so they attached ropes to the children and the cows and the animals so they could mingle, range, graze, and play without dying. And so I immediately went, oh yeah, I went up all these mountains. So this 14er here and this 14er here. And I was leading up climbs like it was no big deal. Well, I'm like, you're walking up a 14er. You're not dealing with a 600-foot drop off. So to me, it was relatively, tame. And it just really expressed that sensibility that was DNA ingrained that, yeah, watch for trouble, but don't make trouble if it's not there. And I think that intensity, I don't have a 600-foot drop off at the edge of my yard. When I pull out my car, I don't have to worry about tumbling into the abyss, so.
Right. Okay. Right. Annabelle, do you want to continue on with, I guess, 379 now?
The figure of the magician has a no less dangerous equivalent in women. A sublime matriarchal figure, the great mother, the all-merciful, who understands everything, forgives everything, who always acts for the best, living only for others, and never seeking her own interests. The discoverer of the great love, just as the magician is the mouthpiece of the ultimate truth. And just as the great love is never appreciated, so the great wisdom is never understood. Neither, of course, can stand the sight of the other. Shall I continue?
Sure.
Yeah. Here is cause for serious misunderstanding. For without a doubt, it is a question of inflation. The ego has appropriated something that does not belong to it. But how has it appropriated the mana? If it was really the ego that conquered the anima, then the mana does indeed belong to it, and it would be correct to conclude that one has become important. But why does not this importance, the mana, work upon others? That would surely be an essential criterion. It does not work because one has not in fact become important, but has merely become adulterated with an archetype, another unconscious figure. Hence, we must conclude that the ego never conquered the anima at all, and therefore has not acquired the mana. All that has happened is a new adulteration, this time with a figure of the same sex corresponding to the father imago and possessed of even greater power. From the power that binds all creatures, none is free except the man who wins self-mastery. And that's a quote from Goethe, the Geheimnisse ein Fragment. Thus he becomes a Superman, superior to all powers, a demigod at the very least. Quote, I and the Father are one, close quote. This mighty avowal, in all its awful ambiguity, is born of just like such a psychological moment.
Okay, Jordan, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, especially from the Goethe, from the power that binds all creatures, none is free, except the man who wins self-mastery. I mean, that's the self-knowing of one's inner nature. not something outside that's ultimately intellectual. And it's not even possession or dominion. It's almost a shedding down to the discovery that I am part of nature, or we are each part of nature, because that binds all creature, none is free. Well, we're in nature, except a man who wins self-mastery. And the self-mastery is not a conquest of self. It feels, from my perspective, it feels to be I'm living in nature naturally, my way, my life, my way kind of thing. And there'll be some pieces. I love the ein Fragment, a fragment. I am a piece of the whole of nature. I am a fragment, as it were. And that goes to that fragment of the divine spark that each of us, got pierced with as we came in, so to speak, from the stories.
Righto. And that is what our former president lacked. Okay, and so like Icarus, who flies too close to the sun, we're about to see a mighty fall. And I'm not saying it's going to come this week, because I think after Thursday, it's likely that Merrick Garland won't allow any indictment until after the election, by custom or tradition in the Justice Department. But after that, Katie barred the door.
Well, and also that 22nd Amendment thing, for him to run again, he has to admit that he did not win last time. Otherwise, it'll be third term he's running for, and that would be constitutionally illegal.
Yep.
Even though it wouldn't hold up that he, just because he said he won doesn't mean he actually did. But philosophically, conceptually, he'd have to admit that he lost. Otherwise, this would not be a second term. It would be a third term. And, the Constitution says,
Yeah.
Hit the door, dude.
Yeah. So 381, Jordan, why don't you read that?
In the face of this, our pitiable, limited ego, if it has but a spark of self-knowledge, can only draw back and rapidly drop all pretense of power and importance. It was a delusion. The conscious mind has not become master of the unconscious, and the anima has forfeited her tyrannical power only to the extent that the ego was able to come to terms with the unconscious. This accommodation, however, was not a victory of the conscious over the unconscious, but the establishment of a balance of power between the two worlds. Shall I continue that next one to clarify this too?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hence the quote unquote magician could take possession of the ego only because the ego dreamed of victory over the anima. That dream was an encroachment, and every encroachment of the ego is followed by an encroachment from the unconscious. Verse from Faust, changing shape from hour to hour, I employ my savage power. Nice. Consequently, if the ego drops its claim to victory, possession by the magician ceases automatically. But what happens to the mana? Who or what becomes mana when even the magician can no longer work magic? So far, we only know that neither the conscious nor the unconscious has mana. For it is certain that when the ego makes no claim to power, there is no possession. That is to say, the unconscious too loses its ascendancy. In this situation, the mana or mana must have fallen to something that is both conscious and conscious, or else neither. This something is the desired, in quotes, midpoint of the personality, that ineffable something betwixt the opposites, or else that which unites them, or the result of the conflict, or the product of energetic tension. the coming to birth of the personality, a profoundly individual step forward, the next stage.
Right. So in terms of the collective, I think that something new will be born. In other words, our national neurosis can't be sustained too much longer. We can't just keep tugging to the left or tugging to the right. We have to find something in the middle somewhere, some shade of purple. And it may be more magenta or more lavender, I don't know, but it's going to have to be a mixture of the two, and it's going to arise from the middle of the opposites. Okay. And so those who don't understand it are going to be sort of obliterated when the rubber band breaks, I would say. Go ahead, Annabelle. Let's.
Well, I have a question about the way that he's discussing the notion of personality here.
Mhm.
Is the idea that one does not have I guess maybe the word would be something like authentic personality until one has, I don't know if achieved is the right word, but kind of accomplished an individuation process? Or is it more the idea that there is a personality and it's, already existing, and that it is the task of the individual to recognize it?
Well, I think he's saying both, actually, but
Okay.
but
That doesn't clarify, but thank you.
the objective of Jungian psychology is summed up in the individuation process, and that means on all the dualities that are operating in your psyche, and there can be thousands of them, all of them, man, woman, light, dark, magic, sensate, whatever it is. All of those have a midpoint, and your fate is tied in with the total combination of all of those, which is what he calls, which is alchemy, okay, in the psychological sense. And the task of individuation is to know that that's going on, understand that that's going on, and then live your life somewhere in the middle ground. And what we've been sold in our politics collectively up until now is the idea that we either have to pull hard to the right or pull hard to the left. Well, no, we don't.
No.
We already have a good country, but we can't just keep trying to destroy one another, or we will destroy ourselves too. And I mean politically, because we don't see it in the grocery store. We don't see it at the drugstore. And so, we have to find an accommodation for all of our opposites. And it's not strictly whether I'm a Trump supporter or not. It's whether I think that I can let others live and let live, for example. That would be one thing. It is, people who say, well, you made a mistake, now get out of their family, traditionally, or, especially in the last couple hundred years, mothers have told their daughters, if your husband cheats on you, the marriage is over, get out of the marriage. Well, that's not the right answer necessarily. And the right answer is to learn from that experience and have the marriage grow from it, rather than destroy the marriage, which, the last 100 years, we've been destroying all these marriages, and therefore we have 50% divorce rates and all the problems related to one parent children and all that stuff, which could be avoided if we can work through it. Now, some people work through it by going to family counseling of some sort or by psychotherapy, what have you. But we have to understand as a collective, not only the people that can afford to go to psychotherapy, that we have to find a middle ground. Okay, that's the essential thing. And, in all these things and in all the opposites in our psyche. Okay, I'll shut up.
No, I think three specific things. The third one will speak directly, I think, Annabelle, to your question, your comment. But the first one, historically, until the late 70s or early 80s, women still weren't really allowed. I mean, it could happen, but to own property. So they would stay in the marriages because otherwise they would be, cast asunder in the ocean of the world, not given credit cards, not given ability to get a mortgage. When the woman negotiates all the terms on the mortgage and her name goes first, and then the man's name is down here second, they'll get a letter or a call addressing the man still. And so point one. But two, I think the midpoint of the personality is, one, the concept, the center is not necessarily in the middle. And I think what happens is, I wrote in the margins, both and when it's up in intense, both and when it's down in intensity and banal, or both and when it's each correspondingly one way or the other. It's always attuned to just how intense it is at any given time. And then to go back to your comment, Annabelle, I think this midpoint of the personality, this ineffable something betwixt the opposites, it comes back to that intensity of, if I look at it politically over history, I know people who are extremely Taurian, bullish, not in the stock market, but personally, and almost immovable, but they're not inflexible. And they will change parties based on the tide of which, in a way, it's evolving rather than what the public hearsay is going around. And so if I look back to Federalist, well, at what point in the 1800s was a current Democrat actually a Republican back then? And a Republican would be a Democrat now. And how this tide coming in and out betwixt and between, historically, politically, some people just hang out right here and go, I'm going to pick the people who I with integrity resonate with, and I'm not going to attach this, oh, you have to choose one or two, these parties. No, I'm going to go with a third option, which is going to be my discernment of any given environment, and I will move from that position. So if that speaks, I think, historically, politically, to your comment on the personality, I think it's directly related to the intensity, up or down or side to side of wherever it is. And my visual metaphor is, I'm going to stand with a foot in the ocean and a foot on the sand, but I'm going to hover, and the coastline is right here, and I'm going to move like this, and I'm going to stay on the coastline. And now I have regulated balance that's always intense. It's always landborne. It's always oceanic. But I'm going to see, oh, look, there's all these trash shells on the beach. Or later, when the tide comes in, oh, it's just water and sand and dunes. And I think there's a perspective shift that people get bullied by in their personality, always trying to keep track of the Joneses, so to speak, and what's the latest soundbite in the news, instead of having an indelible personality that's pretty immovable, but not inflexible. If that speaks in any way, I think, to your comment. I mean,
well, one of the things you're talking about there is enantiodromia. And
Yeah.
of course, in the collective, in our politics, the parties have changed sides at least twice since 1860.
Right.
I mean, Abraham Lincoln was a member of the GOP, was a Republican, but at a time when Republicans had values that Democrats have now.
Right.
And meanwhile, the Democrats had had values that the Republicans have now. And
Mhm.
so the South, when I was coming up, was always Democratic. People like George Wallace and many others who no self-respecting Republican would touch with a 10-foot pole. But now, boom, the South has gone over to the Democrats. I'm sorry, the Republicans, and now we're seeing Republicans start to jump ship again and come back over to the Democrats. Obviously Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are good examples. They're not coming all the way over to become Democratic, but they're waiting for the pendulum to swing back.
Right. There's that tide.
And so 4 years from now, we will still have a Democratic and a GOP, but the GOP will be vastly different from what it is today, and probably the Democratic Party will be too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I hear you both bringing up issues that have to do with morals and principles.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things you're talking about, Jordan, is kind of setting or recognizing one's own set of principles and then staying with them. And by staying with them means shifting with various dynamics of the time as they change. I want to give an example just now. A few things, just thousands are running through my head, but here's an example I think is pretty cogent to what we're talking about, and it relates to what we all talked about at the end of last week, which is that Skip is going to be substitute teaching.
Yeah.
And this notion of being around children in the education system the way it is right now is a real responsibility, and one has to go in there with one's principles 100% intact and shining like silver armor,
Absolutely.
Not that one needs to be brittle, but one does need to hold to one's own. So one classroom I was in during my brief education career, which will never end and never started, but anyway, in that little period of time when it was my main income, I was given a second grade reading book for my class, and all the kids had to read it. And there was a story about what's essentially a souk, right? A bazaar. And it took place in a, quote unquote, Arabic kind of place, and the drawings looked a lot like Morocco, because this was, a second grade book. There were pictures and there was a story. And the notion of the story was that there was a child who wanted to not sell. This is the point. He wanted to trade for barter things that he had made. So he had made something, like I made a necklace out of beads for an orange to trade it, and having no middle currency.
Mm.
And the moral of the story was, for me to use that phrase out of Alice in Wonderland, the Duchess with the morals and the queens with their morals, the bottom line of this story was no bartering. You sell for cash or you don't sell.
Mm.
The story was laying out capitalism in a very elementary way, where it was shown in the story that the boy was going to get gypped and he shouldn't trust anybody, and he should never trade something and not give it a dollar value. And he was punished by his parents, and they were right to punish him. I mean, it was astounding. And I spoke to the children about it. And of course, because I was already being monitored and surveilled and questioned, and they were preparing to fire me anyway, I was told to be quiet by the person at the back of the room, the adult, who said, don't question the story. This is the textbook. That's the lesson. You're working on vocabulary. You're working on, whatever the hell. But I could see that what I was working on was propaganda.
Propaganda, absolutely. And that's how we end up being what we are.
And you were actually trying to peddle ideas to get them to put these things together and decide.
Yeah, and of course I was trying to create conversation. I was trying to create other ideas. I talked about things kids may. I mean, I said all the wrong things, because everything I said was about creativity, ideas, and to elicit ideas from the children. And the reason this story popped into my mind is one of my principles has to do with the rights of the child. And in the United Nations, there was drafted a document. I forgot what year it is now. I used to have it memorized, but a document that was the rights of the child. And the United States is one of the countries that has voted it down and is dead set against it. Children have no rights.
Well, in your example, I saw a video last week that was really short, and it was these two Slavic women, and they were both selling tortillas, which was exotic, in a Slavic country, Mexican thing. And this woman on the right had a stack of tortillas, and they were 150, whatever the currency was each. And the one next had the same similar stack, and they were 45, whatever the currency is each. Well, everyone's buying the 150 because they think they're higher quality. And the other woman is grimacing. And then when the woman with 150 sells out, she looks over, and the other woman, it's still 45, and she lowers it to 25 to try to, get someone to bite. And the other woman leans over the table, looks at the price, hands her the money, takes all the tortillas, and changes her price to 350.
Yeah.
Because that's business. It's like, but I think your children's rights to actually hear an adult say, and I put this together this thusly. I mean, the moral of the story, and then they can agree or disagree or discuss, but they're beyond letters and numbers and characters and language composition. They're into ideas and how they interact.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in our local school district, it's very clear that if you're a substitute, you're going to come in and you're going to teach the lesson plan, not else. And and so that is certainly controlling the learning path and the development of psyche in all children, in the same way. Okay. And, this is why people want to get religion passed in the schools so that they can keep pushing their religion. And so I don't object to that per se. If you're going to send your children to public school, that's what you're going to get. I don't object to that. But what I do know, and this is the hopeful sign, is that the children are going to learn way faster than the school is going to let them, if they can. Okay. Right. And I'll just I've given this example a couple of times before, but I'd love to give it again, which is that there is a TED Talk out there where an Indian man went and put a laptop in an alcove outside in Chennai, what used to be called Madras. And he wanted to see if anybody would use it. I mean, this was at least 20 years ago, if not 25 at this point. And so it was still necessary to have an external modem, and the modems were pretty slow. They were 300 baud or something like that, which is pretty slow. Even my first modem was a modem that you put the telephone into the modem device, and then it would work, and it was 300 baud. But anyway, he left it there for 2 months, and when he came back, he was looking to see what people might have learned, whether it be children or adults. And this 8-year-old kid comes up to him and he says, "We need a faster modem." and I've also seen the same phenomenon going on in Pakistan. So if it's going on in those two countries 25 years ago, you can imagine what's going on in the United States now. Kids are really computer savvy, whether or not they have a computer at home. Certainly in this district, they have the access to a laptop computer in every classroom, and they learn how to use it. And so they definitely have the power to learn way faster than we do in traditional education. So, I say, okay, if you're a teacher, go in and teach the party line, because there's no point in fighting City Hall, and you can be assured that the children are going to find their own way today in the world as it is.
It's true. A friend of mine's 7-year-old, her mom called me laughing. She goes, "Oh my God, Jordan, you told her about kneeling to the Google Oracle to find more perspectives." And she came home one day, and her daughter's sitting there just like, ASDL, JKF, semicolon, turbocharged speed. And her mom said, "Well, what are you doing?" She goes, "School was so boring today, but Jordan mentioned kneeling to the Google Oracle. I'm gonna see how other people and how many other people look at this differently, because if I can't take this boring, I'm gonna skip school." And but she was going and finding all these dissenting opinions, and they were talking about addition and subtraction, and it was relatively mundane. But then she had all these ideas brewing just because her creativity wasn't sparked during school. And she's like, "Yeah, I learned how to do this. I get the numbers, but what am I going to do with them?" But I laughed. She, went and kneeled to the Google Oracle to find all the other perspectives on what to do with addition and subtraction.
Yeah. Right. Annabelle, you have a question here from Amelia Jurlik. She asks, "Annabelle, are you a fan of David McClelland by chance?"
David McClelland is a familiar name, but I don't remember what the name. Who is David McClelland? Do you know, Skip?
No, I don't.
David McClelland. Well, let's go to the Google Oracle, right?
Oracle. Nice.
It really does sound familiar, and also it sounds like it could be Scottish.
Yeah, I don't really do tarot readings. I have a little teleprompter.
American psychologist, no idea. Motivation-based theory, nope, no idea. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
And when I got my master's in education, we did not learn David McClelland, if that's something about his psychology. We studied many, but I would say, Skinner, Piaget, it was pretty
Great stuff. Three
stuff.
steps of learning, Piaget, et
Yeah,
cetera.
but I mean, I will say that the principal psychology teacher who I had in the master's program that I attended, which was Montclair State University, he was a buddy of Bruce Springsteen because they grew up in the same town and they still hung out together. Ha, ha, ha. But, you know, other than that, there was nothing very deep about the psychology that we were learning. We were learning, you know, the teachers learning everything that fits inside that one little cardboard box. And then we go to the students and then we teach them like one little iota out of that one little cardboard box and forget about the rest of, you know, the universe, literally, you know.
Right, right.
Well, yeah, and B.F. Skinner was pretty much a giant mess of psychological form multiplication tables of actions. If, then, if and only if this, then. And I mean, honestly, his true calling was CIA torture techniques. He was the master manipulator. I mean, so he knew those multiplication tables.
Like Pavlovian psychology issues.
Well, that's where psychology was back then. But you know, we've come a long way in psychology.
Oh, I got my master's in 2013. I got my master's at an advanced age, and that's another reason why I failed the system. Oops, my electric plug. Failed the system, or the system failed me, or whatever you want to say. But I think it's children who were failed.
Well, I think so. Yeah, but I think that
I'm going to be back in classrooms too. There's no question about it. Many people who taught with me, and especially the people I student taught for, were my biggest fans. The ones who just let me loose at their kids, and I only had to answer to them when I student taught.
Not parents.
Seasoned teachers, and they learned a lot and were terrifically inspired, and their kids did phenomenal things.
Right, and the kids today are just leaving us behind. You know, and so we don't have to worry about, we don't have to obsess about them anymore on whether they get a good education or not, because they're going to get an education, and it's going to be electronic, it's going to be online, and you know, yeah, fine, if the school teaches some things, maybe they should learn them, but ultimately they're going to be way ahead of us, is my prediction.
There are some teaching methods. I do have to contradict you just at least a little bit, though, Skip. There are some teaching methods that are damaging, and one of them that I encountered has the name whole brain learning. And I wrote an essay about it because I was unfortunately ended up in a school where that was the teaching method, and it is entirely about suppressing the children. And Diane Ravitch, great educator, a big mentor of mine, published my essay, and I had thousands of responses. And so there are some methods. That's one that, I mean, it should be against the law. I mean, it's
right. So
brainwashing.
Okay, I have to send somebody away, but I want to continue to read.
Yes.
Let's see. Okay, goodbye. All right, so
I was the last reader, though, I think.
You were. Okay, Jordan, you're next at 383. Why don't you read 383 and 384?
Yeah. Is Jordan there?
Oh, Jordan's not there. Okay, I'll read 383, 384 and give him a break. Okay, 383. I do not expect the reader to have followed this rapid survey of the whole problem in all its parts. They may be regarded as a kind of preliminary statement leading to the more closely reasoned analysis which now follows. Okay, so now we're going to get the closely reasoned analysis. 384. The starting point of our problem is the condition which results when the unconscious contents that are the efficient cause of the animus and anima phenomenon have become sufficiently assimilated to the conscious mind. This can best be represented by the following way, or in the following way. The unconscious contents are, in the first instance, things belonging to the personal sphere, similar perhaps to the fantasy of the male patient quoted above. Subsequently, fantasies from the impersonal unconscious develop, containing essentially collective symbols, more or less similar to the vision of my woman patient. These fantasies are so wild and unregulated as a naive intelligence might think. They pursue definite unconscious lines of direction, which converge upon a definite goal. We could therefore most fittingly describe these later series of fantasies as processes of initiation, since these form the closest analogy. All primitive groups and tribes that are in any way organized have their rites of initiation, often very highly developed, which play an extraordinarily important part in their social and religious life. Through these ceremonies, boys are made men and girls women. The Caverondas stigmatize those who do not submit to circumcision and excision as animals. This shows that the initiation ceremonies are a magical means of leading man from the animal state to the human state. They are clearly transformation mysteries of the greatest spiritual significance. Very often the initiands are subjected to excruciating treatment, and at the same time, the tribal mysteries are imparted to them. The laws and hierarchy of the tribe on the one hand, and on the other, the cosmogonic and mythical doctrines. Initiations have survived among all cultures. In Greece, the efficient Eleusinian mysteries were preserved, it seems, right into the 7th century of our era. Rome was flooded with mystery religions. Of these, Christianity was one, and even in its present form, it still preserves the old initiation ceremonies, somewhat faded and degenerated, in the rites of baptism, confirmation, and communion. Hence, nobody is in a position to deny the enormous historical importance of initiations, which I would not do, but go ahead. Comments on that?
Oh boy, we talk about propaganda. I mean, the Caverondos stigmatize those who do not submit to circumcision and excision. So circumcision, not such a big deal. Excision would most likely be a clitorectomy. And that to me, I mean, they're saying if they don't do that, they're animals. They're taking away a certain animal piece of the whole physiology. So, I mean, that's the only thing that sticks out to me. Otherwise, I just sit here and cheer with pom-poms about rites of passage being promoted for initiation rites throughout society for different places in life.
Right. And of course, the traditional story of the women's tent, the boys would separate and go out and do things, and the girls would go into the women's tent and do things, and never the twain shall meet. And of course, we have these initiations everywhere. We have them in church. When we say the Marine Corps builds men, the Marine Corps is certainly, basic training is certainly an initiation rite. And when you go to either OCS or basic training, you're not allowed to call yourself a Marine until you graduate, because you have to pass this initiation. Mm-hmm. And then once you do that, you can't, it's unspoken, but it's impossible to even say to people how you changed and life changed from before to after. It's impossible. And, you know, you can say something like, well, it's a brotherhood or it's a sisterhood or something like that. But, you know, that's touching it at the most superficial level. And you can describe all the things you did in training and they still won't understand what happens during that period, because a lot of the things that happen are unconscious. And
the description itself is excised of its experience.
Yeah.
It's not present.
Right. Annabelle, we need a woman's perspective here too.
You need a female perspective. I mean, it just seems to me that modern life, to use a very, very broad term for it, is really lacking in the kinds of rites and rituals that can create a lot of sense of purpose, belonging, identity, and thereby safety and you know, a place somewhere between present and future. And I say that partly, you know, compared to earlier generations that had to do with extended family, that had to do with the role of church, synagogue, religion, something, some kind of community, I think was much more prevalent in an earlier time. And I can speak better about America than I can about other cultures. But I think, you know, when I look, I mean, I'm really reverberating from this shooting in the Safeway supermarket in Bend, Oregon yesterday, just because, you know, it's not a big one. It's not another, you know, there's nothing unusual about it. And that's exactly what's so horrible about it. And where did these come from? And one of the things that I believe that they come from, and I'm thinking of the guy in Connecticut who shot all the kindergartners, you know, this kind of isolation, broken family. Who do you answer to? Who hears you? Where do you belong? I don't believe that I have the answers or that I fully understand what's going on, but I think it is somewhere in what we're talking about right now.
Oh, absolutely.
I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, I even brought up an African proverb Sunday morning when we were doing Answer to Job, which is the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth.
Yes. Yeah. Very much what I felt about Bend. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
okay.
I think the next paragraph speaks directly to that, your point.
It's yours. It's yours. Go.
Okay.
Modern people have absolutely nothing to compare with this. Parenthetically, consider the testimonies of the ancients in regards to the Eleusinian mysteries, Freemasonry, l'Église gnostique de la France, legendary Rosicrucians, Theosophy, and so forth, and l'Église gnostique being Church of the Gnostics, and so forth, are all feeble substitutes for something that were better marked up in red letters on the historical casualty list. The fact is that the whole symbolism of initiation rises up clear and unmistakable in the unconscious contents. The objection that this is antiquated superstition and altogether unscientific is about as intelligent as remarking in the presence of a cholera epidemic that it is merely an infectious disease and exceedingly unhygienic. The point is not, I cannot be too emphatic about this, whether the initiation symbols are objective truths, but whether these unconscious contents are or are not the equivalents of initiation practices, and whether they do or do not influence the human psyche, nor it is a question of whether they are desirable or not. It is enough that they exist and that they work.
Yep. And he makes this same point basically in the transformation symbolism of the Mass, which is an essay he wrote about the Roman Catholic Mass. And, the point, people a while ago, and this is a real sign of immaturity and of lack of understanding. 20 or 30 years ago, people were saying, well, okay, Mr. Priest, do a communion and then let us test whether your wine has turned to the blood of Christ, and whether the bread has turned to the flesh of Christ. And that completely misses the point entirely, because it's doing something unconsciously that has no necessary effect in the physical world. I mean,
yeah, you have to let that bread sit around for several weeks before it starts to look fleshy. But actually, Jung said, he didn't say products are static, but he did say symbols are generative. And I love that he's making the connection here between symbols being the unconscious promotion of rites of initiation, to have that generative piece that takes a child to an adult, that takes an adult to birth the rest of their life. I mean, all these different passage points through life, the responsibility of initiation out of adolescence, child becomes a parent of the man or the woman, that's forced upon the child in that culture. But then third to middle of life, that's then the individual's responsibility to create the passage for them to be the parent of, birth the rest of their life. And I think that's where the myth, I call it the myth of the midlife crisis, comes, is from people who had no initiation and rites of passage at adolescence, now have double the confusion, not knowing why they're so freaked out. Well, it's because they never became an adult. And now they're looking for someone to give them permission or tell them what to do. Except the reality is now is the point where they're supposed to tell the rest of their life what they're going to do. But they don't even have the point to get into that kind of scenario or the experience of initiation to adult themselves into that scenario.
Right. So Amelia makes some further comments, Amelia, and so I should read them. It makes sense that the tribe people would think it natural that the young men and women have to psychologically prepare for the ceremony as it is necessary, but how they manage is surprising. Is it learned helplessness? Do they have to accept that their tradition or flee? I'm going to skip what Penelope said for the moment. Maybe the healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers. Where did you find that quote, Penelope? Good question. Yes, Jordan, when children have no choice, they must live with the adverse childhood experiences into adulthood. And, when these things were controlled by tribes, that is true. But now kids, if they have a computer, they can get out from under anything, I think. Yeah,
and I think also the rite of initiation is not a learned helplessness. And it's not a confining, it's actually an honor to move forward and evolve in the culture of a village. Whereas now, most people who have not had rites of passage or initiation view someone telling them you must undergo this trial as you're in trouble and you have to suffer. Instead of, in previous societies, it's you need to rise up to be a force of nature in your own way. So I don't think that the learned helplessness applies in initiation procedures. I think that's a modern version of victimization and victimhood. And I will say also too, yes, anyone who's cruel or mean is the ultimate weak personality. Cruelty and meanness comes from someone who has a love of power, who often has had no power, meaning they have no power of love. They've never understood the true difficulty of staying connected and being in life in a way that it's going to hit you right and left, but that you stay in it intensely. So I think there's a lot of mix. I appreciate those comments, but I think there's a lot of mix of what we're speaking about with initiation rites versus the modern culture that does not have those initiation rites, coupled with abusive or adverse conditions in childhood. The initiation is not to have to carry them forward. In fact, it often will burn them off.
Right. Okay. Annabelle, do you have a comment here?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm ready to move on.
Okay. Amelia's referring here to unrequited love, which is on page 146, paragraph 231. And I would just say that I'm not going to go back to that because we already handled paragraph 231 weeks ago, and we have to move on. So
Simple though, I would say unrequited love is one of the ultimate cruelties anyone can do to someone else, because it means lack of discretion.
it means what?
Lack of discretion.
Yeah.
Unrequited has zero responsibility. It's completely acting in the moment. Now, passionate is actually a completely different thing. So, but I agree. Going back that many paragraphs is we've covered that in another video.
Right. Okay. Annabelle, you want to read 386?
Yeah. 386, not the modern men have absolute. Oh, yeah, you're right. Oh, 386. Since it is not possible in this connection to put before the reader in detail these sometimes very lengthy sequences of images, I trust they will be content with the few examples already given, and for the rest, accept my statement that they are logically constructed, purposive sequences. I must own that I use the word purposive with some hesitation. This word needs to be used cautiously and with reserve. For in mental cases, we come across dream sequences, and in neurotics, fantasy sequences, which run on in themselves with no apparent aim or purpose. The young person whose suicide fantasy I gave above was in a fair way to produce a string of aimless fantasies, unless they could learn to take an active part and to intervene consciously. Only thus could there be orientation to a goal. From one point of view, the unconscious is a purely natural process without design, but from another, it has that potential directedness which is characteristic of all energy processes. When the conscious mind participates actively and experiences each stage of the process, or at least understands it intuitively, then the next image always starts off on the higher level that has been won, and purposiveness develops.
Great. You want to comment on that, Jordan?
Yeah, I like that. And starts off on the higher level that has been won, and purposiveness develops, meaning as you up the octaves, as you develop, you also develop I'd say a greater verb. I mean, if I abstract purposiveness down to a minimum, you're able to act more clearly. Your actions have a new and invigorated heart of the matter from the higher level. And I think in that sense, more and more people are less and less cruel or omissive, and they actually become more compassionate. In a sense, they become unthreatened, where they're strong enough to be gentle, fierce enough to be compassionate, because when you're unthreatened, you can listen. You don't take other people's BS on. You just hear them confessing their BS to you instead of at you. So I think the purposiveness, what a word, develops along with the different octaves we travel in our psychological development.
Right.
I think this also relates to what we talked about early this evening about drive and about the accomplishing of projects and how we go about that. And the fact that, you know, again, Skip, with that particular project you talked about, the anima overtook you, you set yourself down at a table, and then there it was, a novel was manifested, right? And created. But on the other hand, I think that there is a very important principle that he's talking about here, which is that we do have to take actions. And we do have to pick up that pen or open that computer or have the computer or I mean, in, you know, that very cliche expression, you know, the greatest journey begins with one step. I mean, we have to take the steps, and we have to take the steps without that sort of magical thinking that, like, you know, I have this fabulous idea that I'm gonna have a house as big as Bill Gates's house, and all I have to do is imagine it in my mind and do a few things, and, you know, abracadabra, it's gonna exist. It's not an abracadabra magical world, but there is magic in the world, and the way the magic works is through action.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Jung even said, you're not what you say you are going to do. You are what you do. And so that action you bring up is of the utmost. In fact, I think that action is a better expression of the purposiveness. It takes the abstraction out of it.
Right. Okay. We're at 9:42. Rather than go on to 387, because there's some very juicy stuff coming up, but I really want to give it more time next week. What I want to do is just offer an example of what he's talking about moving from a dream to an active imagination, which I have one specific experience with that personally about 5 years ago, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so the dream was, I was going to a southern town as a journalist, and I convinced someone to take me to a Ku Klux Klan meeting because I wanted to interview some people for an article that I was doing about the Klan. And so we go to this meeting, and the traditional archetypal things are happening. And suddenly I find myself in a jail cell in Old West kind of jail in the sheriff's office, right? Sheriff's office is out in front and the cell is in the back type thing. And the deputy takes me out of the cell and walks me into the sheriff's office, and the sheriff is there in uniform, and he has a huge mane of white hair and a beard like Jordan's. Okay, so then end of dream. That was
Gandalf.
the, huh?
Gandalf.
Yeah, or a god image or what have
Yeah.
you, right? Okay, now, I said, well, okay, what's that telling me? Because I'm I'm not a journalist. I'm not going to see the Ku Klux Klan. And I've had enough experiences with those types of things. And then, so I drove up to work, and which took about an hour turnaround. And while I was driving back, which is a half-hour trip, I decided that I would do an active imagination. And I haven't done a lot of active imaginations in a while. So I just decided to say, okay, I'm going to drop myself back into that dream situation where I'm in the sheriff's office with the sheriff and see what happens. Okay. So all of a sudden we hear this great clamor outside, and I step out onto the porch. It's nighttime, it's dark, or it seems nighttime and dark. And we step out onto the porch, and there's this throng of Klansmen. And what happens is that the sheriff puts up his hand over his head like God would do, or something like that. And the Klansmen part so that half are on one side and half are on the other. And there's a path, and the path goes to the horizon. And on the horizon, above the horizon, is an eclipsed sun. And while we're watching, the eclipsed sun moves aside, because they only last 3 minutes or whatever it is to be perfectly eclipsed. It was a total eclipse, but it got light, started to get back light again very quickly. And all of a sudden there's daylight. The Klansmen all disappear. And the next thing is I end up on a beautiful meadow that's, green and fully natural and wonderful place. And so that was the active imagination. I wasn't asleep when I was having that part. And so I was intervening consciously, and I was doing what Jung said here, basically, which was taking the unconscious content, which includes everything up to the sheriff's office, and everything out from the sheriff's office was an act of imagination. And so what do you think? You don't have to interpret if you don't want to, but I have some thoughts about it. But
Seems you went from the Ku Klux Klan to Rumi, so quite a jump in a good way.
yeah.
I mean, the eclipse, there's a poetry in the eclipse that's transformative. And that's then when the poetry of the eclipse daylighted them away, washed. It's hard to see light in the light or light in the light, and washes them away. And then you're on this wonderful meadow. Maybe I'm adding the word wonderful, but Rumi came to mind of, I'll meet you in that field, where then there was a certain, when they were dispensed with, when they were eroded or burned off alchemically, there was this beautiful nature of a meadow as a thought.
That's good. That's good. Annabelle, you want to take a crack at it?
I don't, I hear it through my, I don't know if you could call them filters, but my, current obsessions, I guess you could call it. It's just a couple of days ago that somebody said to me, well, the Klan comes from the clans. of Scotland, and that it was the Scottish Highlanders who came to the highlands of the Appalachians who created the clan, which was out of clannishness. And so we can just keep flipping back and forth between the C and the K and the C and the K. And so that was the first thing that I heard when you mentioned the clan. You live in the South, so that places your dream within the kind of environment that you live in. And then another thing that I heard from it, because I'm just moving, I'm doing the Bota deck. So I just completed the 9 of Cups. So I'm moving, this is the card that I'm studying now is 10 of Cups. So
Wow.
even though it's not a sun, it is that view of that horizon. And at first I thought of a dream I had, as you described, looking out, they parted ways and then you look forward. And I thought it was like the way a marriage ceremony, and because it's clans, then they're splitting up, and here's the Montagues and here's the Capulets, or whoever it is, they're sort of splitting into their clans. And then you're going forward. And I thought of a dream image from a dream I had, which was my tower dream. And there I had come on a weaving road, got to the tower. There was the tower. It was under construction. It was not going to be a good place for me to climb up. The architect was giving up on the project, and I just kept going. And I knew that going out of that little sort of like the little towns in Nevada where the speed limit goes from 90 miles an hour down to 25, and you only have a little ways, a couple of blocks, and then boom, you're out there. And that was a beautiful weaving road out into the the distance.
Right.
There, because of your various John Ford movie images, those are the pieces of it that I got.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
historically, may I ask you, Annabelle, historically with the Scottish Highlanders, wasn't there drought or famine, and they were kind of quote unquote politely evicted in a way from the Highlands, such that they
clearances. Those are called the clearances.
The clearances, to where
and it relates to those English laws of enclosure also. So that was about class and race, and there were Highlanders who were slaves.
Right.
So there's a whole, there's a lot that.
There's a point when they came over here, then there were very few Scottish Highlanders in the Highlands anymore. They'd come over here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and they were just plain murdered too. Yeah,
plain murdered. Right.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that.
Tell us some secrets, Skip. About
tell us your gig on it.
Well, that came up at a time that I think Trump had just won the presidency. I don't think he had even come into power yet. But the way I took it was, as it was expanded, I didn't know what it meant up. Well, I had some ideas of what it meant up to the sheriff's office, but I didn't understand the connection to Trump until I got to the next piece, to the active imagination. And then when I saw the eclipsed sun, I realized that this was because of Trump, that the land had become dark. But I also was reminded that this too will pass. The eclipse will go away, and the sun will come out in a bright meadow again. So I found it as a very encouraging dream, and at a time when we were just falling into the morass of Trump. Now, we're going to start next week with 387, but I want to jump ahead just to give people a little tease. It's a tease. And this comes up in paragraph 395. And I just give you a sense of it. I really marked this paragraph as very important with an arrow and everything. I mean, with an orange arrow. And
Well,
so,
really quickly before you do, I think one last piece, astronomically or astrologically with your active imagination. The funny thing about the new moon, I mean, the moon has no light of its own, right? It reflects the sun. So a new moon is the sun and the moon conjunct. So that means, of course, it's daylight on the other side of the planet, but at night in a new moon, you can't see the moon because it's obscured. And so it's honest and it's true. But then when you get the same conjunction with a daytime, day sky moon, that's then an eclipse. So you get that dark body that's covering the light, which I think kind of feeds into that Trump piece of, that darkness literally coming in front of the sun.
yeah. So this is from paragraph 395. It's by no means all of paragraph 395, but I want to read it because it came up in a situation for me quite recently. And I think this paragraph is perhaps the most important paragraph that exists in this book. And actually, this quote that I'm going to read, I consider very important. Okay, so I'm only going to read 2 sentences of it. In his dealings with the visible world, a man must certainly be mad to suppose that he is the master of this world. Here we follow quite naturally the principle of non-resistance to all superior forces, up to a certain individual limit, beyond which the most peaceful citizen becomes a bloody revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I read it again?
Yes.
Okay. Here we follow in their dealings with the visible world, a human must certainly be mad to suppose that they have mastered this world. Here we follow quite naturally the principle of non-resistance to all superior forces, up to a certain individual limit, beyond which the most peaceful citizen becomes a bloody revolutionary. And so, we saw it in Kansas. We've seen it in several other ways, what the reaction of women is, especially to the decision about abortion from the Supreme Court. And
Because there may be the guy who keeps getting, sand metaphorically kicked in his face, being bullied and put down and put down and put down and et cetera, except one day it stops and the being put down starts to fill up the rage. And the tiniest, mousiest little human being, man, woman, child, or whatever, can throw a vicious right cross and drop the biggest of, there's a whole David and Goliath thing that goes on with that, of how someone fills someone's rage tank where, that most peaceful of citizens becomes a revolutionary.
Yeah. So here's a good quote to end on. Richard Casper says, eclipse sun equals Jesus, calling you to have a higher calling than your world is offering. And then Justin says to Richard, happy to know that I gave the speech at my older brother's funeral exactly during the total eclipse in 2015. And so that's a very interesting thing.
For those two.
Yeah. And Amelia says, I've certainly learned a lot tonight. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. That's what we're here for.
Me too.
I always learn a lot, no doubt. Every
Yeah.
time we do one of these sessions, I learn a lot. So thank you everyone
Well, I
for
love
being
putting
here.
the perspective, back and forth, because we each bring something. It's not so much all roads lead to Rome. We each have our perspective, and I think they dance together really wonderfully, which I always learn something different way to look at it even.
Yep. And Penelope says same here. And Penelope is in London. And meanwhile, we have this creep trying to take over my chat again. So you're going bye-bye.
And the bounce says 86th.
Mhm.
What?
The bouncer says 86th.
Is that what it means?
Yeah, 86th means you're kicked out. I don't know what the number reference. Now that I think about it, I don't know.
Oh, no. You don't know what it is? It's the number of keys on a piano.
Oh, really?
That's what
So
it
then,
is.
okay. Yeah. So no more music.
Just
No
out.
more.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're out.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I thought it was 88 key.
Well, maybe it's 88.
No,
But colloquially, the way
86.
I learned it, 86 had to do with the number of keys on the piano. But you might be right. 88 does sound right for the actual keys on the piano.
Right, but
Yeah.
the colloquial number for getting
Yeah.
someone out of a lounge would be 86, because you're going to take the two off the end and knock the middle right out.
Something like
Yeah.
that. Something like that.
yeah.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Peace, everyone.
thanks,
Thank you
guys.
for
Yes,
being here.
thank you very
tonight.
much.
Yeah. Take care now.